if I told you that behind every dazzling chandelier of the Gilded Age lay a quiet tragedy that no one wanted to see? Late Victorian America and England were times of incredible wealth, but the glare of gold blinded society, rendering invisible those who provided this luxury. These were servants who worked themselves to exhaustion, literally to the point of death, and whose deaths within the walls of wealthy mansions were dismissed as common illness. Watch the video to the end to learn how working in a golden cage became a death sentence for thousands of invisible servants, and why their deaths were called natural causes, even in the most egregious cases. I will reveal the most closely guarded secret. The true luxury of the Gilded Age was measured not in carats of diamonds, but in the number of hidden human tragedies. The era known as the Golden Age was a time of extreme social inequality, where the wealth of a single family could equal the budget of a small country. Maintaining this standard of living required a huge staff of servants, whose work was not just hard, but truly murderous in its intensity and inhumanity. In the mansions of New York, London, and Chicago, servants formed an invisible army, ensuring the perfect facade of their masters' carefree lives. And their daily schedule was far from the modern concept of work. Unlike factory workers, their work had no clearly defined beginning or end, and their lives were subject to the whims and schedules of the family, making rest an almost impossible dream. The average working day for a maid began around 5 in the morning and could end well after midnight if the owners were hosting a reception or a ball. Her duties included not only cleaning and cooking, but also fetching coal, lighting fireplaces, and washing huge amounts of laundry, which was dried and ironed by hand. These endless hours spent on their feet, without sufficient sleep or meals in a calm environment, exhausted the body to the limit, making it vulnerable to any illness. Servants were strictly forbidden to get sick. Colds or fevers were not considered a reason to stop working, and they often served wealthy families while hiding their ailments for fear of being fired without a recommendation. Losing their job meant immediately losing the roof over their heads and their source of income, which put them on the brink of starvation. So working to exhaustion was a lesser evil than unemployment. The conditions were particularly harsh for cooks and maids, who worked in huge, poorly heated or, conversely, unbearably hot rooms. Cooks spent most of their time at huge stoves, where temperatures reached unbearable levels in summer, while maids constantly breathed in dust and fumes from cleaning products containing hazardous chemicals. The living conditions of the servants were appalling. Often they were small, cold attics or basements where several people slept, making such rooms an ideal place for the spread of infections. In this sense, servants in wealthy homes suffered from disease no less than the inhabitants of the poorest areas of the city, but their illnesses were invisible to society. Young girls who had come from villages or Ireland were particularly vulnerable, as this work was their only way to survive and earn some money. Their inexperience often led to mistakes for which they were severely punished, deprived of sleep, food, or wages. When a maid literally collapsed from exhaustion, her employers often perceived this not as a symptom of exhaustion, but as laziness or dishonesty. Their death within the walls of the mansion was an extremely undesirable, but often occurring event that had to be dealt with as quickly and quietly as possible. Death from exhausting labor, which caused pneumonia or heart failure, was almost always recorded as natural causes, so as not to tarnish the reputation of a pious and respectable family. We would be very interested to hear your opinion. What do you think about the price of luxury in the age of splendor? Write about it in the comments. While you're thinking about it, don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on other historical investigations. Are you ready to learn the truth about how servants coped with a schedule that physically killed them, but was considered the norm? The reality of working in a wealthy household at that time was so far removed from modern standards that it could be compared to forced labor, with one difference: it was legal. While the owners spent their evenings at balls, the servants worked without breaks, catering to their every whim and desire. There were no laws regulating working hours for domestic servants, which gave homeowners complete freedom to exploit the labor of others. A typical day began with the awakening of the master's family, but for the servants, it started long before that, with the need to light all the fireplaces, bring water, and prepare a hot breakfast. If the head of the family liked his eggs at a specific time, the entire household had to adjust to this one item on the schedule. By this time, the maids had already managed to sweep, dust, and put away everything that had been scattered around the evening before, and they had to work as quietly and inconspicuously as possible. After breakfast, the main stage of work began: general cleaning, laundry, ironing, cleaning silver and crystal, as well as preparing for lunch and dinner, which could consist of 10 or more courses. Servants were often given lunch between two main tasks, and they had to eat in a hurry without the opportunity to rest properly. Proper rest was completely unthinkable. Even in their free time, servants had to remain within reach so that they could immediately respond to their master's call or request. The systematic lack of fresh air, poor lighting in the utility rooms, and monotonous, often meager meals also contributed to the accelerated aging and illness of the servants. Servants aged much faster than their masters, and by the age of 30 could look like people of a much more advanced age. History has not preserved many of the names of those who dropped dead from overwork, but the collective memory of the era tacitly acknowledged that this was the price to pay for wealth. But knowing the schedule is only part of the problem. Ready to learn how death from overwork was turned into consumption or natural causes in documents? I discovered this by accident while studying the archives, how the deaths of servants in Victorian mansions were documented so that no one would ask unnecessary questions. Death in a wealthy household was always undesirable, as it could give rise to rumors, attract the attention of the press, and, worst of all for the owners, ruin their reputation as virtuous Christians. Therefore, each such case required a quick, quiet, and legally flawless elimination of traces, which began with the issuance of a death certificate. In those days, medical examinations were often not very thorough, and doctors who served wealthy families were loyal to their high-ranking clients and valued their favor. If a young and seemingly healthy person died suddenly, exhausted from working long hours, his death was almost always explained in convenient and vague terms. The most popular diagnoses were consumption, heart failure, or sudden disorder, all of which could easily be attributed to physical weakness or genetic predisposition, but not to working conditions. Doctors did not perform autopsies unless there were clear signs of violent death, and in cases of overwork, often leading to heart attack or stroke, the body bore no marks that would indicate an external cause. Death in one's sleep or at work, where a person literally collapsed from exhaustion, was easily explained by an acute illness that supposedly developed rapidly. Thus, the medical document became a kind of official letter that relieved the owners of any responsibility and closed the case. The servant's family, if they existed at all and were aware of what had happened, rarely had the opportunity or the means to challenge the doctor's conclusion. They often lived far away, had no influence, and the very fact of challenging the decision of a wealthy person was practically unthinkable in that strict social hierarchy. The employer could show mercy and pay for a modest funeral, and sometimes even give a small sum to the family, which served as a kind of bribe for their silence and prevented any attempts at investigation. This whole system was designed to preserve the facade of Victorian morality and order. The death of a servant was not a tragedy, but an unfortunate inconvenience that had to be dealt with as quickly as possible. The term natural causes in this context did not mean death from old age or illness, but death from a system that was so ruthless that its consequences seemed inevitable. Thus, the lives of servants were turned into silent sacrifices on the altar of someone else's well-being, and their names remained only in archival lists without any precise indication of the reason why their lives were cut short so early. Please don't forget to like this video if you think these invisible tragedies of the past should be remembered. What if everything we were taught about the ideal Victorian lady is outdated, and we don't know the whole truth about women in service? Most domestic servants were women, and their lives were particularly difficult, combining physical exhaustion with constant social and moral pressure. For many young women, working as a maid was the only alternative to a life of complete poverty, but it carried with it many risks that were not discussed in polite society. Their working day was not only physically demanding, but also emotionally exhausting. Maids, nannies, seamstresses, and laundresses were constantly confined to a small space, under the close and often unfriendly supervision of the lady of the house or the senior housekeeper. Housewives often saw young maids as rivals or objects of their moral superiority, so they treated them with particular severity and nitpicking. Any minor mistake could be a reason for public humiliation or severe punishment, which created an atmosphere of constant fear. Washerwomen and maids who did the dirtiest and hardest work suffered from chronic illnesses associated with constant contact with cold water, steam, and caustic cleaning agents. Rheumatism, arthritis, and skin diseases were occupational illnesses that turned these women into emaciated old women by the age of 30. Constant standing, heavy lifting, and the inability to sit during the day led to irreversible problems with the spine and legs. The living conditions in the attics or basements where the girls slept were not only uncomfortable, but also dangerous. It was unbearably cold in winter and stuffy in summer, and the overcrowding led to the rapid spread of tuberculosis and other infectious diseases. In this closed world, cut off from outside society, maids were also vulnerable to harassment from male servants or even their employers, and they had no way to protect themselves. A maid who became pregnant was immediately thrown out onto the street, losing both her job and her reputation, which was tantamount to social suicide. Their lives were devoid of joy and personal relationships. Maids were rarely allowed to leave the house, and meeting young men was out of the question, which deprived them of a normal youth and the opportunity to start their own families. Thus, they sacrificed not only their health, but also their entire personal lives for the sake of maintaining someone else's luxury. As a result, these women worked themselves to exhaustion in conditions that destroyed them physically and morally, while society chose to ignore their existence. But how did society manage to ignore the obvious when deaths from overwork followed one after another? Constant and chronic sleep deprivation was one of the fastest and most effective tools for destroying the health of servants in the Gilded Age. This factor, seemingly not as dramatic as physical abuse or starvation, actually undermined the body from within, rendering it completely defenseless. It was normal for servants to sleep 4 to 5 hours a day, and this routine remained unchanged for weeks, months, and sometimes years. The inability to recover after 12 to 15 hours of hard labor led to the accumulation of fatigue, which was comparable to slow poisoning. Chronic sleep deprivation directly led to a decline in immunity. The exhausted body could not resist infections, and a simple cold quickly developed into pneumonia, which was often fatal in those days. Servants worked in a state of constant drowsiness, which increased the risk of accidents. They could drop heavy dishes, burn themselves with hot water, or stumble on the stairs, leading to injuries. The masters, however, did not see this as a consequence of fatigue, but simply as clumsiness for which the servant was to be punished. Lack of sleep also caused psychological problems, such as increased irritability, decreased concentration, and even depression, but these symptoms remained unrecognized. Servants were expected to be polite and cheerful at all times, and any signs of fatigue or bad mood were taken as a personal insult by their employers. As a result, they were forced to hide their condition, driving their illness and nervous exhaustion even deeper. This cycle of exhaustion and forced concealment of their condition was vicious and almost always led to a premature end. As a result, sleep, which is a basic need for any living being, became a luxury that servants could not afford. Their employers believed that by providing shelter and food, they were already doing them a great favor and saw no need for normal rest. Lack of sleep was not just an inconvenience, but a slow and sure killer, which the system successfully disguised as natural causes of illness. Are you ready for the shocking truth about how servants lived? The service quarters in mansions of the Gilded Age were hotbeds of disease, providing the perfect environment for the spread of deadly infections. This was in stark contrast to the luxurious and well-ventilated halls where the masters lived, and this contrast often proved fatal. Servants lived in cramped conditions. 5 or 6 people could sleep in a single small attic or basement room. This was due to the owner's desire to save as much space as possible and not allocate too much valuable floor space to the servants. In such conditions, any infection brought in by one person instantly spread to everyone else, turning the room into a quarantine isolation ward, but without the possibility of quarantine. Tuberculosis, or consumption, was a real scourge of the servants. This disease, transmitted by airborne droplets, thrived in cold, damp, and poorly ventilated rooms. Weak immunity caused by lack of sleep and poor nutrition made the servants' bodies an ideal target for Koch's bacillus. A sick servant could not stop working, continuing to serve the house and come into contact with others, thereby only accelerating the spread of the disease. Sanitary conditions in the servants' quarters were also far from ideal. Unlike the master's bathrooms, which were models of cleanliness and hygiene, the servants often had to use shared, poorly maintained toilets that were not conducive to good health. The lack of hot water and soap for personal hygiene also increased the risk of infection. The owners did not pay attention to these conditions until it threatened their own health, but by the time they noticed the illness in a servant, it was often too late. Servants who died of consumption were ideal victims for concealing the real cause of death. It was the most common disease of the time, and no one questioned its naturalness. No one associated it with slave-like working conditions, overcrowding, or lack of medical care. The disease provided a convenient excuse to attribute death to individual weakness rather than a systemic problem. When a servant fell ill, he could be dismissed immediately to prevent the infection of his masters and their children, which meant death on the street or in a workhouse for the sick person. Thus, even within the walls of a wealthy mansion, a servant was completely deprived of any social protection and medical care, becoming a victim not only of infection, but also of inhuman treatment. It was a terrible paradox, to work in luxurious conditions, but to die from diseases associated with extreme poverty. And yet, how did the masters explain these deaths to themselves and others? What did they say when they saw their servants literally withering away before their eyes? Are you ready to learn new details about the psychological defense mechanisms that allowed the rich to ignore the tragedy of others? For the owners of Victorian mansions, it was psychologically necessary to distance themselves from the human essence of their servants in order to justify their exploitation. In their minds, a servant was not a person, but a function necessary to maintain their luxurious lifestyle, and this mentality allowed them to avoid feeling guilty. They saw their servants as nothing more than hands, feet, and part of the decor, which had to work smoothly and be invisible. This detachment was expressed in complete indifference to the living conditions and health of the servants. The owners could spend a fortune on treating their dog or buying a new dress, but at the same time easily refused to pay for a doctor or medicine for a servant. A servant's illness was perceived as an unfortunate breakdown of a tool, not as a personal tragedy. If a servant died, another immediately took his place, and life at home continued as if nothing had happened. They created a kind of psychological barrier. Servants lived in the lower world of basements and attics, which was separated from the upper world of ballrooms and living rooms, not only physically but also mentally. The owners rarely went down to the service quarters, preferring not to see the conditions in which their employees lived. This allowed them not to associate the splendor of their mansions with the dirt and dampness in which their servants lived. The religious and moral doctrines of the time were also used to justify this situation. Servants were often seen as a lower class, who were supposedly less sensitive to pain or less in need of comfort. In their view, hard labor was not exploitation, but salvation from sin and a way to keep the poor obedient and morally pure. In this way, the rich convinced themselves that their exploitation was even a kind of benevolence. Any attempt by a servant to complain about conditions or illness was perceived as a sign of ingratitude or weakness of character. The masters believed that the servant had no reason to be dissatisfied, since he was provided with shelter and food, which was already a lot in that era. This prevented servants from openly talking about their problems and forced them to remain silent and endure until the very end, so as not to lose their jobs. Although most servant deaths during the Age of Splendor went unnoticed and undocumented, a few testimonies have survived that lift the veil of secrecy surrounding this grim phenomenon. These accounts, often recorded in the diaries or letters of former servants, describe conditions that are shocking in their inhumanity and ruthlessness. In one letter, a maid who worked in a wealthy London household described her typical day, which began at 5:30 a.m. and ended around 11:30 p.m., during which time she was not allowed to sit down even for a minute. She wrote that her only desire was to just lie down on the floor and never get up again, and that she had to constantly fight the urge to fall asleep on the go. She mentioned a colleague who once fainted while washing dishes and was immediately fired because she spoiled the view in the presence of the mistress. Cooks who worked at the stove for 16 hours a day described chronic swelling of their feet, burns, and constant headaches from the heat and fumes. One of them wrote in her diary that she saw a young dishwasher who was sick with fever fall into a vat of dirty water, but was forced to get up and continue working because there was no one to replace her. This story eloquently testifies to the fact that work was above everything else, even human life. These few but important entries show that the servants were well aware that their work was leading to premature death, but they had no other choice. They knew that they were working not for a life, but for a mere existence, and that their only way out of this situation was death or complete physical exhaustion. These personal testimonies break through the wall of silence erected by Victorian society to hide its unpleasant side. One of the most tragic consequences of the exploitation of servants in the Gilded Age is the utter injustice of memory. The historical chronicles of the time are full of detailed descriptions of balls, dresses, scandals, and triumphs of wealthy families, but say almost nothing about those who made this luxury possible. The memory of the servants has been erased, their names forgotten, and their contribution to history remains invisible and unappreciated, which is yet another humiliation. When a wealthy person died, their death was accompanied by obituaries in newspapers, lavish funerals, and lengthy epitaphs that glorified their virtues and achievements. A deceased servant, on the other hand, was honored with only a brief entry in the church book, and at best a small nameless gravestone on the edge of the cemetery, paid for by the master from the remains of his salary. This contrast in funeral rites reflected their position in society. Some were important in life and after death, while others were always insignificant. The archives and family histories of wealthy households have preserved thousands of photographs, letters, and documents. But finding personal records or photographs of servants is an almost impossible task. Servants did not have the opportunity to keep diaries, as they had neither the time, nor the personal space, nor even the light in their cold rooms for such an activity. All that remains of them are names on payroll lists and rare detached mentions in their master's documents. This lack of memory is the result of deliberate dehumanization. Since servants were not perceived as people but as labor, their departure was not considered a loss. Society saw no need to remember those whose lives were entirely devoted to serving the needs of others. This oblivion was the final act of destruction, erasing even the traces of their existence. Thus, the historical narrative of the Victorian era remains one-sided and incomplete, glorifying the rich and ignoring those who actually built this era with their backbreaking labor. Restoring the memory of servants is not just a historical task. It is an act of justice towards those whose lives were stolen for the sake of someone else's glory. Their stories must become part of the common understanding of the price of progress and luxury. The tragedy of the servants who worked themselves to death during the Age of Splendor left behind a profound, albeit implicit legacy that can be traced throughout the history of social reform. Although society ignored their suffering for a long time, Their collective invisible sacrifice ultimately contributed to a slow but steady change in attitudes toward labor and the rights of the working class. Deaths from overwork, though hidden behind euphemisms, accumulated, and this silent testimony became impossible to deny over time. In England and the United States, the growth of the trade union movement and increased attention to working conditions in factories gradually spread to domestic servants, although this happened much later. The laws on minimum working hours and sanitary standards that appeared at the beginning of the 20th century were indirectly caused by these invisible tragedies, by the realization that the human body cannot withstand endless exploitation. This was an acknowledgement that natural causes were often just a code name for death from work. The literature and art of the time also began to feature the first tentative images of suffering servants, which, although romanticized, nevertheless drew attention to the problem. These images, in which servants were portrayed as loyal but exhausted and sad figures, were the first steps toward humanizing this class in the eyes of society. Society gradually began to realize that the splendor of mansions came at too high a price. Today, when we look at luxurious Victorian mansions, we must remember not only those who lived in them, but also those who died serving them. The history of servants is an important reminder that social justice requires not only laws, but also human compassion and a willingness to see those who are in the shadows. Their tragedy became part of the historical price humanity paid for the Industrial Revolution and luxury. We have examined in detail how the golden facade of the Gilded Age hid a cruel reality in which thousands of servants worked themselves to exhaustion, and how their deaths from exhaustion, sleep deprivation, and disease were disguised as natural causes. From murderous work schedules to unsanitary conditions and legal cover-ups, the entire system was geared toward exploiting these invisible people to the utmost. Their tragedy is a story of how human life was devalued for the sake of someone else's luxury. Which of the stories or aspects of the servants' lives did you find most shocking and unjust? Share your thoughts on the invisible victims of the Gilded Age in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so we can continue our exploration of the darkest and most forgotten pages of history.